Welcome to something short and sweet in the Parsha. This week, Parshas Behar Bechukosai. We're going to do a little something different this week. Not a regular Devar Torah, a great story. The HaChaim HaKadosh, HaChaim ben Atar, one of the greatest of all the biblical commentaries. You'll find his commentary in every Mikros Gedolos Chumash. At one point in his career, he was incredibly wealthy. And his practice was that each and every Friday, he would have an animal slaughtered, and he would disperse the meat of that animal to aniyim, to poor people. One Shabbos, Hashgacha would have it that his animal was the only one to be kosher for that particular weekend. And it makes sense that everyone started coming to him. They wanted some meat from his behemoth, but it was for aniyim, it was for paupers. And each piece was earmarked for a certain one. One of the very wealthy people from the community came to him, and he at first politely asked for a cut. HaChaim HaKadosh responded, "I'm very sorry. Every piece of meat has a name on it." And as they were discussing it, a pauper came over, and the HaChaim took a package, and he gave him the meat. This wealthy man was beside himself. He couldn't believe it. That guy, that schlepper you're giving, and he starts berating the HaChaim HaKadosh. And then he starts berating the pauper, who happened to be a great Talmud Chacham, a scholar. And the HaChaim had to make a quick decision. Was he going to step in, or was he going to just let the man scream? And hopefully he would soon see the back of him. And he decided that's what he was going to do. Well, the incident was over, but the incident was just beginning. That night, Friday night, the HaChaim HaKadosh had a dream. He was told that in heaven, they were not very happy with him. He stood by when a Talmud Chacham, an Ani, was embarrassed. And he shouldn't have done that. And in order to have a kapara, in order to have a atonement, in order to do tshuva, he would need to go into Golus. Back in the day, as a step toward the process of repentance, very often people would go into exile. They would take their pack and they would go into the unknown where they were unknown. And that was a very humbling experience. And this would be the beginning, because we know that arrogance, we know that a person thinking highly or too highly of himself is the beginning of all sin. And therefore they would go into Golus. And this was suggested, in that dream, was suggested to the HaChaim HaKadosh. Go into Golus. So sure enough, after Shabbos, Sunday morning, he packs his bag, and he takes a walk. That Thursday, he finds himself on the outskirts of his city. And he starts thinking about the Parsha. It was Parshas Bechukosai, this week's Parsha. And he looks at the first words of the Parsha, in Bechukosai telechu v'esmisbosav tishmoru v'asisa mosam. 3 phrases which seem to be saying very similar ideas. In Bechukosai telechu, if you will go on my statutes, v'esmisbosav tishmoru, and you will watch my mitzvahs, v'asisa, you will do them. And there on the spot, it must have taken some time, Reb Chaim ibn Atar came up with 42 approaches to what that verse means. Now we have a concept in the Talmud, ayin panim l'Torah, that God, being the amazing author that he is, he put within every pasuk 70 approaches, 70 facets. Like a beautiful diamond, you look at it from this way, you see one thing, you look at it from that way, you see it another thing. Sometimes you find in the commentaries, they will say 2 approaches, 3 approaches. 42 approaches in one verse you never find. Interesting that if you look in a Mikrot Kedolos Chumash, in the Pirush of the HaChaim HaKadosh, on this verse, you find 42 gems, 42 different Pirushim in Bechukosai. The next day, he gets into town. It's Erev Shabbos, comes into shul, and he's greeted by one of the balabatim. Will you stay at my house? Not knowing this was the great HaChaim HaKadosh, one of the Gedolei Hadar, giants of the generation. And he graciously accepts the invitation. And Shabbos begins. They have Kabbalah Shabbos, they go home, they have a beautiful meal together, they discuss Torah. Of course, he's not disclosing at all who he is. At the end of the meal, the Balabas, he says, our rabbi, he's a Mekubal, Kabbalist. We go back to shul after every meal, and he gives a shir, and sometimes he gives a shir on esoteric things, Kabbalistic things. It's a wonderful shir. Do you want to come? HaChaim HaKadosh is very excited. Of course, just up his alley. His Pirush on the Torah includes all sorts of Torah explanation. It has pshat, remez, sod, drush. It's all there. He was a great Kabbalist himself. Well, they go into shul, and the shul is packed. Everyone in the community is there to hear the Rav's shir. And the Rav begins. In the yeshiva Shel Mala, in the heavenly yeshiva, they're saying over Torah that was thought of this week by Rebbe Chaim Ibn Attar. The HaChaim HaKadosh is in the back of the room. He hears his name and he hears himself being called Rebbe. And he screams out, Chaim Ibn Attar, as to correct the Rav for calling him Rebbe. Oh, the Rav is very upset. Who is this guy in the back of the room? But he doesn't say anything. He's a guest. They go home. Everyone's wondering about this fellow in the back there. They go home. They go to sleep. Come the next day, they go to shul. Everything is quiet. Everything is very congenial. They eat the meal again. And the Balabas says, would you like to go to the shir again? The Rav continues his shir. And they go to shul. And again, the place is full. And he starts his shir. And he says, I want to say over what they are learning in the yeshiva Shel Mala. 14 approaches in Bechukosai Telechu from the great giant Rebbe Chaim Ibn Attar. And again, from the back of the room, the HaChaim HaKadosh screams out, Chaim Ibn Attar. The Rav is flustered. He is really beside himself. But it's Shabbos. He doesn't say anything. He continues 14 beautiful approaches. The same thing happens after Shalosh Shudas. It's now late. Everyone comes to shul. The sun has already set. They're waiting for Mariv. And the Rav begins. The last 14 approaches in Bechukosai Telechu, in the yeshiva Shel Mala, out of the mouth of Rebbe Chaim Ibn Attar. And a call from the back comes again, Chaim Ibn Attar. The Rav looks outside. He says, Shabbos is over. Grab that man. Ach, chutzpah. How does he talk that way about the giant of the generation? Two of the Rav's henchmen grab him. He says, take him upstairs. We'll have to see what we're going to do with him. They take him upstairs. They daven Mariv. People go home, they make Havdalah. And all of a sudden, there's a storm. A supernatural storm. The people are frightened. The Rav is frightened. They come running to him. Rebbe, do something. This is not normal. He says, I don't know what's going on over here. He says, I'm going to do, great Kabbalists, I'm going to do a She'elas Chalom. I'm not sure exactly what that is. You'd have to be a Kabbalist to know. But I think the person who is performing this, he goes into sleep, and somehow in his sleep, he asks from above, he asks a question. She'elas Chalom. Question in a dream. And that's what he does. And he somehow communicates with whoever they communicate with. And here's the answer. Yes, this storm is supernatural. It's because of you and the people in your community. Because normally what happens is people, when they pass for a year, we know they go to Gehenna, they go to the purgatory. And every Shabbos there's a reprieve, there's a furlough. They get out of the purgatory for Shabbos. And they only go back to Gehenna after the Gadol Hador, the giant of the generation, makes Havdalah. So they're agitating to get back to where they belong. But the Gadol Hador, Rebbe Chaim ibn Attar, has not made Havdalah. Because you have him in the attic of the shul. Release him. And of course, the end of the story, the Rav goes back and he apologizes. The HaChaim HaKadosh forgives them. He realizes that he attained his kapara for being someone who not known. So he was humbled by hearing Rebbe Chaim ibn Attar and having the whole community upset with him. And he was ready now to go home. What's the moral of the story? Maybe chew it over at your Shabbos table. Have a very wonderful Shabbos. Thank you so much for listening.